So, with the release of the Homelander trailer for Mortal Kombat 1, it got me thinking about two things. The first is how I hate how we have to wait entire seasons to get one new character instead of just getting entire combat packs released all at once. And the other is about how cool it is to know that by proxy of Chronica and the Hourglass, it's implied everything preceding MK1 is canon in some way. The endings of MK11, the arcade endings of every game, the movies, the comics, etc. Not only is it a tongue-in-cheek way of acknowledging how once arcade mode is over, the game resets like none of that ever happened, but it also fixes a lot of the retcons and continuity errors throughout the mainline series by proxy of Chronica messing with the timeline. And then I thought to myself, this is like what DC did with Rebirth and is doing now with Infinite Horizons. And then I remembered the first time I played a Mortal Kombat game. 2008's Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. I did see it in stores but had no interest initially, but after stumbling across the complete cutscenes for the Mortal Kombat side on YouTube, I was hooked. I liked the idea of having superheroes fight video game characters. And as you can imagine, it was my first introduction to a lot of these characters, including some I had never heard of up until that point, like Deathstroke, Captain Marvel, and Darkseid. This was also the first time I learned Batman and Superman were DC characters. So yeah, I have a lot of nostalgia for this game, and will even go back to it from time to time. But as time went by and I started learning more about both franchises, I started to realize just how fundamentally broken, at its core, the idea of these two brands meeting was. And unsurprisingly, a lot of people have a similar sentiment. So I decided I'd just give my own honest thoughts as to why it just didn't work. Not like some full-blown essay where I just break it down or whatnot, but more so my own speculation. And so, this is my idea as to why I think Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe crashed and burned. Before we get into the game itself, I feel like it's important to discuss the state of Mortal Kombat back during that time, as it does lay down a lot of groundwork for what I'm about to say. Without a doubt, Mortal Kombat has always been a popular series since its conception. But let's be honest, Mortal Kombat's real heyday was the 1990s. With its primary gimmick of being shocking and extremely gory being its main draw, particularly its uniquely brutal fatality system. But it would go on to earn a fanbase by also providing solid gameplay that any fighting game fan could enjoy, which quickly made it a rival to similar games like King of Fighters and Street Fighter, and it left a major impact on gaming as a whole, being a huge reason the ESRB rating exists today, and spawning plenty of movies, TV shows, comics, and plenty of bargain bin knockoffs, as well as games with similar inspirations. But that would all change with the advent of the 2000s, which would give rise to the Midway era of Mortal Kombat games. Known for its signature 3D fighting system that would forsake the original 2D gameplay from the arcades for one much more reminiscent of Tekken instead. And while people do have good memories of these titles, and would never call all of them bad, the general consensus is that, in terms of gameplay, they were stiff, clunky, and awkward to play. The inputs didn't always work, the hitboxes would sometimes not register that the opponent was hit, and the games just looked ugly. Even the best looking games of this era still looked unfinished, especially compared to its contemporaries. And while the sales weren't too good, they were still a bright spot in the gradually sinking ship that was Midway. But this bright spot was definitely more so a flickering flame, as the popularity of Mortal Kombat, while still prevalent, had pretty much seen its height with the arcades, especially with each new game bringing in slightly less money than the last. So, when the HD era of console games were coming in hot, Midway decided it was time for a completely fresh start, and that 2003's Mortal Kombat Armageddon would be the final game set in the original timeline, and a full-on reboot was put in the works. While we don't know much about this version of MK8, what we do know is what was originally planned. It was going to be much darker in tone. Its visual style would have been reminiscent of Gears of War, and many of the things introduced in the 3D games would be scrapped. The 3 fighting styles, the control scheme, create a fatality, air combat, they were going to reinvent the entire Mortal Kombat franchise from the ground up. But Fate would have other plans, because somewhere along the way, Midway came up with a new idea. The Mortal Kombat franchise was effectively a dying brand struggling to remain relevant in a changing landscape. So they decided, instead of a hard reboot, they would instead cross Mortal Kombat over with a non-dying franchise. And this franchise was DC Comics. And considering the growing superhero hype that would eventually lead to the superhero renaissance of the 2010s, and Midway was struggling to keep its head above water, Midway basically went to Warner Brothers, asked to make a crossover, and they agreed to let them use the DC characters. That's basically what it boils down to. And I think that's where the first problem comes in. It's a crossover. Now, I know people might not think that's a big issue considering we get crossovers all the time, but the thing is, that wasn't always the case. The day and age we live in, people love crossovers. Ever since Kevin Feige and his shared Marvel universe proved that crossovers can not only make for good storytelling, but also engage people in a way that will make them want to keep coming back, studios have embraced this mantra like some kind of holy grail. Heck, some companies have practically become famous for it. But let's not kid ourselves. Before the MCU proved crossovers can be just as valid as any other story, at the time this game was made, crossovers were seen as gimmicky. Which they still are, but in this case, it was a clear sign that people were desperate for money and were quickly running out of ideas. And to give an example of just how little people thought about crossovers at the time, back in 2004, 4 years prior to this game's release, people were trying to get a Batman vs. Superman movie off the ground. But David Goyer, the would-be primary screenwriter of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, among other executives, rejected the idea, with his reason being,
Batman vs. Superman is where you go when you admit to yourself that you've exhausted all possibilities. It's like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, or Freddy vs. Jason. It's somewhat of an admission that this franchise is on its last gasp.
Oh, the kryptonite-enriched irony. So yeah, the idea of a crossover itself was probably not the best idea, especially given the promise that Ed Boon made prior to this game's announcement. I am aware that Boon said he always wanted Mortal Kombat to be a part of a crossover, but in this case, it's pretty clear that a crossover shouldn't have been the first choice. Especially since this game was very, very rushed. And this is where the mere concept of this game starts to fall apart. Simply put, a crossover could have worked if it was with literally anything else except DC. But before we continue, if you're enjoying the video so far, please be sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification button for more great content like this. And if you really want to help my channel out, please consider joining me on Patreon. Every little bit helps to create bigger and better content. But until then, let's continue, shall we? So, as you can imagine, a company with a largely family-friendly image being asked to have their characters star in a bloody, violent video game had the exact reaction you'd expect to this prospect. They were happy to do a crossover. What they weren't too keen on was having their characters brutally murder someone, or being brutally murdered themselves, over and over and over again. Especially at the prospect of much younger fans wanting to play as their favorite DC heroes. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's kind of hypocritical on DC's part, isn't it? Especially since they've made their fair share of violent things as well. But let's not forget that while DC has been publishing some messed up comics for years at that point, it wasn't until the 2010s that they made a real push to be darker and more violent to differentiate themselves from their competitor, Marvel. But even with all those attempts, their main appeal, even to this day, is still primarily held by a general audience, and DC has never really dabbled into the same level of shock and gore as Mortal Kombat. After all, there is a difference between learning your sidekick is doing drugs, suffocating on poisonous gas, or backs being broken, and ripping out people's still beating hearts, skinning them alive, or turning them into ground chuck. And yes, while they do have characters that would be at home in Mortal Kombat, let's be honest, any character in a crossover fighting game is going to be picked primarily on how recognizable they are. Don't get me wrong, Lobo and Red Hood are popular characters, but they are not Superman or Batman. Regardless, something had to change, and that change would be one of the most controversial choices in the history of Mortal Kombat. They toned it down to a more acceptable T for teen rating. They effectively removed what was a main staple of the Mortal Kombat franchise. And if that wasn't bad enough, the US cut had to be censored even further. They effectively threw away that darker, gritty reboot that they originally promised people, and making it the first and only time Mortal Kombat would ever neuter itself to appeal to people. To some, this might not be a bad idea, but removing the sheer, absurdist, even downright comical violence from Mortal Kombat is like taking the adventure aspect out of Adventure Time, or removing Jesus from The Chosen, or turning the Looney Tunes into an edgy superhero show.
Hey, wait a minute.
You're removing a huge part of that thing's identity by doing that. And nowhere can that be felt more than in the main draw of any Mortal Kombat game, the fatalities and brand new heroic brutalities. Often called the worst finishers in the entire franchise, the best ones are generally considered passable, while the worst are notoriously bad. Being broken into a million pieces or having flesh vaporize off your body, no blood or otherwise, still makes for a believable fatality. But then you've got others, like, how is Raiden dropping Batman from high up supposed to be fatal when Superman does the exact same thing and it's not lethal there? How is it that Batman has a more lethal looking finishing move than Kano, a literal mercenary and cartel leader? And that's ignoring how some of these look like they're straight out of a character's standard moveset. Which leads into another issue, something that even the most diehard of Mortal Kombat fans acknowledge: the power scaling. While the champions of Earthrealm and their enemies are far from weak, they could hardly compare to the heaviest hitters of the DC universe. Like, Raiden blowing up a temple and Cyrax destroying planets is impressive, but Superman alone can not only do the same thing with his bare fists, but he's also able to fly fast enough to escape literal infinity and survived being crushed between two god planets. Heck, Superman on the regular goes up against enemies that could easily one-shot even the most powerful of Mortal Kombat characters. So I know what you're thinking. How do they fix this? How do they make it to where that Liu Kang can actually hurt someone like Superman without just breaking his bones upon trying? They remedy this by saying that with both worlds colliding, energies between the two realities are constantly shifting and redistributing between all living things. In other words, this is how the Joker can beat up Wonder Woman, or how Sonya can go toe-to-toe with Lex Luthor. But even then, they are still technically their normal selves. It's not like they took some kind of special superhero serum or some kind of super pill. Minus the gods, the champions of Earthrealm are still as human as they were previously before. Look, I'm sorry if I sound like the Force Snake here, but am I really supposed to believe that Captain Marvel would die from falling arcade machines, or that Catwoman would be able to take down Shao Kahn just by scratching him?
That makes no sense.
You don't even have things like stage fatalities that, now that I think of it, could actually work really, really well in a toned-down DC crossover. After all, you can still show people getting crushed, you just don't need the blood splatter. I'm getting off track. But I guess in the end I should consider those characters lucky, because some of them didn't even get finishers. Darkseid, Shao Kahn, and Dark Khan. That's just lame. So you may ask yourself, if they had to sacrifice a huge part of the franchise's identity, why did they go through with it? Frankly, the first reason is obvious. The second, while just my own speculation, I'd probably have to guess that DC wanted to recapture the same success that Marvel had with Marvel vs. Capcom, which in that lens honestly makes sense. Regardless, by trying to appeal to everyone, they made a game that appealed to no one really. But now that I made that comparison, we should probably compare it to... So, what better thing to compare it to than its immediate opposite, Marvel vs. Capcom. This crossover franchise is, or at least was, a beloved series of fighting games that were effectively a celebration of nerd culture, with each new game bolstering a hefty roster of characters both popular, unknown, cult classic, and everything in between from both studios. Not to mention, it had a lot of interesting themes going into it. Two companies with massive legacies in both mediums going head to head. It was one studio catalog pitted against another. It was comic books versus video games, East versus West. You get the point. And while there were varying tones amongst the franchises present, they didn't clash too much, or at least not to this point. And in the end, the ultimate goal of any crossover is to attract a new audience from both sides. After all, if a Wolverine fan buys the game and thinks Nemesis is a cool character, you may get a new, loyal customer for Resident Evil. Not to mention, you can make some really marketable rivalries for, well, marketing purposes to hype people up. And while I wouldn't call all of them good, most of them make perfect sense and are eye-catching in all the right ways. Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe, on the other hand, doesn't have that. First, it's clearly not a celebration of either brand, but just a clear gimmick being done to make the money. Secondly, a lot of those same themes that I just mentioned don't apply here, as the roster itself is just stupidly small. Not only does Mortal Kombat on its own have nowhere near as many characters as DC's catalog, even today, if this had, by some miracle, continued as a series, it would be a severely limiting factor that would prevent the roster from ever truly expanding to an even greater size. This could be easily remedied if Midway just, not only used the Mortal Kombat characters, but their entire studio catalog as well. Sure, it'd be small, but hey, at least there'd be more pickings to choose from than just the Mortal Kombat gang going forward. And thirdly, the rosters they ended up going with were, well, safe. Too safe. For the MK side, they basically took the rosters from the first 2 games and went with only the characters you would expect, like Scorpion, Shang Tsung, and Sub-Zero. But at the same time, they also excluded a lot of fan favorites like Johnny Cage. And to me personally, looking at it as a comic book fan, a lot of the characters that were excluded from the game would honestly be much more appealing to a DC fan who is unfamiliar with the Mortal Kombat franchise than the people they ultimately went with. Why? Because characters like Kenshi, Shiva, Shinnok, hell, even two-legged Motaro actually look like they belong in the DC universe. As for the DC side, it's pretty much the same case. It's composed of the characters you would expect. It's just the Justice League and some members of the Legion of Doom. And once again, it's only the most obvious choices, while not even considering representation for other teams in the DC universe. No Teen Titans, no Doom Patrol, no Suicide Squad, nothing. By comparison, with the exception of the Fantastic Four, in Marvel vs. Capcom, almost all of Marvel's most prominent teams are represented. The Avengers, X-Men, Guardians of the Galaxy, etc. And even then, the characters themselves also cross over onto other teams, like the Thunderbolts, Defenders, Legion of Monsters, etc., etc. And once again, as a Mortal Kombat fan, it excludes a lot of characters that would actually fit a crossover like this. But to be fair, it does have a few weirder choices than the MK side does. Unfortunately, its most unique choice is the only character that has no right to be here. Shazam, then known as Captain Marvel. Why is this weird? Because he is canonically 12 years old. So it's kind of weird to know that it wasn't okay for this game to be as violent as its predecessors were, but it was just fine having a literal kid be brutally murdered over and over again. I won't say it's a bad lineup for either franchise, but I think a lot of people agree it could be better. And then we get to the most marketable part of any crossover fighting game. The rivalries. As you could imagine, because of the cast they chose for both sides, they range from mixed or just straight up bad. Rivalries like Raiden vs. Superman and Kano vs. Joker make perfect sense. Heck, I've considered doing both of these for Fan Wars someday. But then you have others that are just tenuous at best or straight up forced at worst. Tell me, what does Jax and Lex Luthor have in common with each other that make them good rivals? That's like Marvel vs. Capcom making Guile the official rival to Doctor Doom. It just doesn't make sense. And that's the case for the majority of these marketable rivals. Baraka vs. Deathstroke, Sonya vs. Catwoman, Liu Kang vs. Green Lantern. And at the same time, you've also got potential rivalries that for some reason were never made into rivalries. And there is no better example of this than Batman vs. Scorpion. This is basically the poster boy for the game, and is probably the best matchup they could get from this crossover. I know this because it's left an impact on a lot of people, even a decade later. But no, they are not each other's official rivals in-game. Scorpion's rival is the Flash of all people, and Batman's is Sub-Zero. Ironically enough, if you just switch the rivals around, those would work much better. My point is, I know these characters were chosen because of both popularity and to act as parallels to one another, but I honestly fail to see the parallels between some of the rivalries they chose. It's not like you couldn't make good, marketable rivalries with good parallels out of the two franchises, but because of the limited roster they went with, there wasn't much wiggle room to explore with. And in the end, it doesn't do a good job at enticing potential players to give both franchises a chance when it's over and done. Even the stage selection is incredibly weak. Like, you get plenty of signature locations from both franchises like Metropolis, the Batcave, the Netherrealm, and Raiden's Temple. But then you get options like the Graveyard or the Special Forces base. I know these are important places in MK lore, with the latter being the first time a stage was designed with the Special Forces in mind, but frankly, to a newcomer, these are just the most generic, unimpressive looking places you could possibly choose. The latter looked like a generic military base, and the former could just be a place that exists in either world. Could they really not just pick a stage like the Pyramid of Argus or Chaos Realm? But wait a minute, you may ask. The affiliated characters don't appear in this game. Those choices would make no sense. Well, I don't see Adenia anywhere, and its princess is a playable character. So, all in all, I think it's pretty clear why, on the simple basis of what these games are, one appealed to a lot more people, while the other did not. But to me personally, what I think really killed any chance of this game gaining any kind of audience was in fact So, I think I've established why this game doesn't work conceptually. So, I think it's time we talk about the most important part of any game. The gameplay. As well as other features it comes with. But before we start, let's talk about what I personally think is the best part of the game. The story mode. While Mortal Kombat games have dabbled here and there with the idea of something similar, this was the first time the franchise actually had a proper story mode. No conquest mode that acts as a prequel that forces you to play as one character, just a straight up story mode where you get to play as almost everyone. And it was even kind of revolutionary for the time, at least for the genre. The basic gist? Raiden and Superman destabilized portals that their respective villains, Shao Kahn and Darkseid, tried to escape through, merging them together to create Dark Kahn, a being of insatiable destruction that is seeking to grind both universes to dust. How? By merging them together into one singular realm, similar to how Shao Kahn would merge Outworld with other realms. As a result of this, energies from both universes are stripped and spread across the realms, not only making it possible for someone like Sonya to beat the ever-loving shit out of Green Lantern, as previously mentioned, but also inflicting intense combat rage on every living thing, which forces anyone afflicted with it into an uncontrollable bloodlust. And so, with time running out, to save their universes, the remaining warriors band together to defeat the opposing sides to save their world. Yep, you heard that right. Sides. This story mode is split up into two parts, told through the perspective from whatever side you choose, and both stories connect really well to each other. For example, in the Flash's chapter, Catwoman tries to escape the hero, but accidentally runs into a portal that sends her to the Special Forces base in Sonya's chapter. Or in Wonder Woman's chapter, she defeats Sub-Zero after he freezes Superman solid, only for him to be freed by Jax soon after this.
I wore him down and sealed him in ice.
And of course, the ending, where, after both universes separate, the villains that we see get yeeted into the void end up swapping universes and are given eternal imprisonment in the worst realms each world has to offer. And I'll be honest, it's oddly cathartic to see Darkseid, Lord of Apocalypse, sentenced to eternal damnation in the Netherrealm of all places. And out of all the things this game introduced, this is what had the biggest impact, as going forward, not only would every Mortal Kombat game include a cinematic story mode, but in the subsequent years, other fighting games would eventually adopt a similar formula. Even Marvel vs. Capcom would eventually give us a cinematic story mode, even though it is eerily similar to MK vs. DC's story, if you ask me. And that was all the stuff I like. First, let's get the Centaurian out of the room. If you hadn't figured it out, this is the final entry of the 3D era of Mortal Kombat games. It's an era that a lot of people have fond memories of, but also gave rise to what many consider some of the worst games in the franchise. And while these were undoubtedly experimental in many areas, the general consensus nowadays is that the gameplay is clunky, slow. You get the gist now, I've already said that. Essentially, the best way to describe them would be dull caliber. But honestly, the gameplay isn't necessarily a game breaker. Some people like the 3D mechanic, and others don't. Heck, even the new rage system that the game introduced isn't necessarily a game breaker either. Yes, it's a pain when the opponent rages and becomes completely invincible and does twice the damage. But they did account for this and made it to where that if two players rage at the same time, the invincibility is completely null and void for both. So once again, a little tricky, but not necessarily a game breaker. But what is a game breaker is the sheer lack of content. In terms of gameplay, aside from the toned down fatalities and heroic brutalities, we don't have any other finishers. No brutalities, no animalities, no friendships, not even that creative fatality a lot of people didn't like. But that's fine, as long as the non-fighting game content is A-okay. Except, that's the thing. There is no content outside of that. If there's one thing about the 3D era that I can give credit towards, is that they did have quite a bit of new content that either spiced up existing gameplay for better or worse, or gave you a break from the fighting. If you and your friends are tired of killing each other, you can always go play Motor Kombat, or that chess game, or the now iconic and beloved Crypt, or even create your own original characters. Except, in this game, it has nothing like that. No Crypt, no create a character, no conquest mode, no chess combat, no Motor Kombat. Heck, it didn't even have a test your might. Come on, that's probably the easiest thing they could have added. Just replace Diamond with Kryptonite and Steel with Nth Metal. Yeah, there is a story mode, arcade, and combo trials, but those get boring and repetitive real quick. And while online mode definitely gave the game some longevity, that is no longer an option because the servers were shut down years ago. Meaning you can't play the game unless you have another person. Yep. For whatever Elder God forsaken reason, they decided not to include a local versus mode, like what Injustice in later Mortal Kombat games would have. This will always be an immediate deduction of points, because this is the game outright forcing you to play everything else except one of the most basic modes a fighting game should have, and requiring you to either play online, which, as I said, is impossible now, or a friend who will play with you. Good luck finding a friend who'd want to play Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe IRL in 2024. Okay, to be fair, some minigames were added to the game, but as actual functions in the battle itself instead of their own separate thing. On paper, this sounds fun. In practice, it's actually my least favorite part of the game. The least awful is Test Your Might, where one character rams you through multiple walls and both players have to mash their buttons with 2 different effects. The one charging through the walls button mashes to increase the amount of damage they do, while the one being pushed through the walls button mashes to reduce the amount of damage caused overall. This is a fair and honestly kind of fun implementation of a classic minigame from the Mortal Kombat franchise. What isn't fun is close combat, where you grab the opponent and play the world's deadliest game of patty cake, where the attacker presses various buttons that all hit a different spot, and the defender must hit the same exact button to end the assault. As you can imagine, people with slow reflexes aren't exactly going to thrive when it comes to this aspect. Which leads to what is without a doubt my least favorite part of the game. Free fall combat, where the opponent goes flying off the edge into a stage transition a la Test Your Might, where it once again plays like close combat, where the attacker has to hit buttons to do damage and the defender must hit the same button to defend. But whereas matching buttons just straight up ends the encounter in close combat, here the opponent can flip you around, and if you don't flip back, any damage you caused will be done to you instead. Sorry if you got the full maximum damage output then got swapped out at the last second. And truth be told, even if at least one can be sort of fun, none of these are reliable at inflicting damage, as there's always a chance of you losing or gaining damage instead. I honestly think Injustice did this better with the Clash system, turning it into a wager you can either choose to participate in, or forfeit to use your meter burns later. Other than that, the other notable thing we have from this game are the now infamous combo trials. They are fun to master, but are tricky to perform. Not because they are fairly designed in a way to make it difficult, but doable, but because the control scheme makes it nearly impossible to complete. So, all in all, I think it's pretty clear why this game never took off. It was a clearly desperate and bizarre mixing of 2 very different properties that failed to appeal to people. The standard clunky gameplay of the time, the lack of an interesting roster for both sides, and the lack of any real content outside of the main gameplay and the aforementioned combo trials is what I think ultimately sealed MK vs. DC's fate. While it didn't underperform, it didn't meet the expectations Midway was hoping for, and soon after, Midway would file for bankruptcy, causing any planned DLC this game had to be cancelled, leaving it as what is now seen as the black sheep of their most recognized brand, as well as their penultimate release. But I don't want to end this video on a negative note. How about we talk about the legacy it left? Though people like to say it shut down, that's not entirely true. Midway did not close down. They were bought out by Warner Brothers, DC's parent company, and like a phoenix rising from the ashes, was reformed into what is now NetherRealm Studios. And the first thing they did was go back to the original plan of rebooting the Mortal Kombat franchise, which led to Mortal Kombat 2011, a game that returned the franchise back to basics and built itself up from that. It had almost every character a fan could want in its roster, lots of fun side modes and mini-games, the first use of guest characters, which has now become a staple in not just Mortal Kombat, but other fighting games as well, and of course, the return of the Crypt, which has been in nearly every Mortal Kombat game since. And not too long after, they would once again have a crack at the DC universe with the now iconic and infamous Injustice franchise. once again building off of the groundwork of what their previous attempt did, and finally blessed DC with a fighting game franchise that can actually stand toe-to-toe with Marvel's. I mean, that is if they decide to keep the franchise going. Seriously, where is Injustice 3? Speaking of which, starting with Injustice, all their games going forward would have a single player versus mode. Hallelujah, this is what I've been wanting. I know it doesn't sound like that big of a deal, as many fighting games have a choice of fighting an AI in any arena, but up until 2015, no Mortal Kombat game ever had that choice. But even without the player versus computer mode, it not only made for a game that was a refreshing return to form, but made a lot of people realize this is the home console Mortal Kombat game they wanted. And to this day, it is widely regarded as one of, if not the best, Mortal Kombat games ever made. But in the end, a lot of what made NetherRealm's games once again stand toe-to-toe with their competitors is thanks to Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. The cinematic story mode has now become a staple of all Mortal Kombat games. The free-fall, test your might, and close combat mechanics would evolve into the stage transitions and clash system that is now a staple of Injustice. And even now, characters from both universes still cross over with one another, showing that the crossover did stick with many people. Because even though the teen rating did hurt the game more than it did help, it allowed a new generation of players to be introduced to Mortal Kombat for the first time. And people have tried revisiting the idea. Jeremy Adams, a writer of the animated Mortal Kombat movies, tried pitching a DC crossover for one of said movies, only for it to be rejected. And I think that is the general sentiment. Not only has DC gone in a darker direction since MK vs. DC, but a lot more of its rough and gruesome characters have become more recognized and popular in recent years. And with the franchise going the route of multiverses going forward, by the way it looks, it may be possible we'll one day see these two universes clash once more, properly this time. But until then, all we have is what is honestly, at its very best, the bargain bin version of Marvel vs. Capcom.